What happens when an army's greatest enemy is no longer the opponent across the front line, but the fear spreading through its own ranks? Something is breaking inside the Russian military right now, not on a map, not in a headline, deep inside the structure of the force itself. And the people in power on both sides have every reason to keep you from understanding it. If this kind of real, unfiltered military analysis matters to you, hit like right now, subscribe before you forget, and share this with someone who actually wants to understand what's happening in this war. Because what we're about to walk through changes everything about how you see the front line. Here's what the official story on both sides will never fully admit. Russian soldiers, not one or two, not a handful of exhausted men in a single broken unit, are refusing orders, not quietly, not in ways that can be swept under a disciplinary rug and forgotten. They are refusing in documented, recurring, unit-level patterns that point to something far more serious than battlefield stress. Something systemic. Something that cuts to the very core of how a military functions, the relationship of trust and authority between commanders and the soldiers they send to die. I spent decades inside NATO's command architecture. I served as Commanding General of United States Army Europe. I have studied, at the operational level, what happens to military cohesion when high-casualty warfare grinds on long enough. And I want to be direct with you. What the available evidence now shows about Russian ground forces along the Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia axis is not a side note to this war. It is one of the most important indicators of where this conflict is actually heading and how much longer the Russian military can keep doing what it's doing before something fundamental breaks. Let's start with the evidence. Because this isn't built on theory or assumption. It's built on multiple independent streams of information that have been accumulating for months and have now reached a level of consistency that makes the pattern impossible to honestly ignore. The first stream is Russian military court records. Russia's military justice system has been processing a growing number of cases involving unauthorized absence, refusal to follow combat orders, and self-inflicted wounds. These records aren't fully public in the way Western military justice files are, but fragments have been documented by Russian human rights organizations, including the successor groups to Memorial, by independent Russian journalists working under real personal danger, and by Ukrainian intelligence assessments that have been partially verified through open-source methods. The documented volume of cases reflects a rate of disciplinary breakdown with no precedent in any earlier phase of this conflict. The second stream is signals intelligence. Ukrainian forces have been monitoring Russian tactical communications along the contact line continuously throughout this war. What those intercepts reveal, fragments of which have been shared through official Ukrainian military channels and cross-checked by independent open-source analysts, includes documented instances of Russian unit commanders reporting to their superiors that soldiers are refusing to advance, assault groups not moving from staging areas despite direct orders, and in multiple cases, soldiers actively falling back from positions they were explicitly told to hold. These aren't panicked messages from individual soldiers. These are officers, commanders, reporting systemic non-compliance upward in language that reflects genuine operational crisis, not routine friction, crisis. The third stream is testimony from Russian prisoners of war and soldiers who have surrendered or been captured by Ukrainian forces. This testimony is gathered through official processes and has been reviewed by international humanitarian organizations. The accounts are consistent across prisoners from different units and different sections of the front. Soldiers describe being ordered into assault positions with insufficient ammunition, with no functioning medical support, with officers who openly told them reinforcements would not come if the assault failed. Soldiers describe being told that retreating without orders means execution, enforced by officers positioned directly behind the assault wave. Soldiers describe watching the men beside them die, assault after assault, against positions that their own leadership admitted couldn't be taken with the forces available. The fourth stream is Russian social media and family communications. Despite the Kremlin's aggressive effort to control information about this war, communities of Russian soldiers, wives, mothers, and siblings continue to share what their loved ones are experiencing at the front. The accounts monitored by independent researchers and journalists have shown a significant increase in messages describing suicide missions. Men left without medical evacuation for days after being wounded. Soldiers threatened by their own officers for trying to pull back from positions being overrun. These are not organized protest groups. These are ordinary Russian families, connected by phone and message to the real experience of this war. 4 separate streams. Independent sources. Mutually reinforcing. And they all point to the same conclusion. The relationship between Russian military command and the soldiers carrying out its orders has broken down to a degree that is producing systemic, not isolated, non-compliance. Now, the important question is, why now? Why is this happening at this point in the war and not earlier? Russian ground forces have been taking catastrophic losses throughout this conflict. That's not a new fact. What has changed in the past 6 to 8 months is the relationship between those losses and what they're actually buying on the battlefield. In earlier phases of the war, even when casualty rates were brutal, Russian assault operations were producing visible results. Positions were being captured. Front lines were moving slowly in Russia's favor in the east. The cost was horrifying, but soldiers and the domestic audience could see movement. There was a story that could be told about progress, however painful. That story has collapsed. Ukrainian defensive evolution, the integration of drone surveillance networks, precision artillery coordination, and layered first-person view drone engagement systems has made every meter of ground dramatically more expensive than it was a year ago. A Russian soldier who has survived multiple assault cycles doesn't need an analyst to explain this to him. He has watched assault groups go forward. He has counted how many came back. He has looked at the ground taken and done the arithmetic in his head. And what that arithmetic produces is not a morale problem in the traditional sense, not a crisis of belief in the mission or attachment to unit identity. It's something more dangerous, a rational calculation. When a soldier watches the assault wave ahead of him take 70 or 80% casualties while capturing 300 meters of trench, he is not being irrational when he concludes that the next assault order he receives is more likely to kill him than achieve its objective. He is being entirely rational. He is reading his environment accurately and drawing the logical conclusion. And when soldiers begin to rationally assess that refusing an order carries a lower expected cost to their survival than following it, the command authority that the entire Russian offensive depends upon starts to crack. This is the moment to press pause on something you might be tempted to take for granted. The idea that armies follow orders, that soldiers advance when told, hold when told, die when told, is not a law of nature. It is a social contract, and like all contracts, it depends on both sides maintaining their obligations. When soldiers consistently see that following orders leads to death with no corresponding gain, that contract erodes. And when it erodes at scale, across units, across sectors of the front, it stops being a disciplinary problem and becomes a structural one. Now let's talk about how Russian commanders are responding to this breakdown, because the response itself is one of the most telling parts of the story. 3 primary mechanisms have been deployed to manage unit-level non-compliance. The first is barrier troops. Dedicated units have been positioned behind assault formations with explicit authority to use force against any soldier who retreats without orders or refuses to advance. This is not new in Russian military history. It has Soviet precedent going back to the Second World War. But its reappearance in this conflict is a structural acknowledgement by the Russian command that voluntary compliance with assault orders can no longer be assumed. Barrier troops are not a sign of confidence. They are a sign that command knows compliance requires coercion. The second mechanism is punishment units. Soldiers who have been formally disciplined for order refusal, unauthorized absence, or other violations are being organized into assault formations and used as the leading elements of attacks. The logic is that soldiers already facing severe consequences for non-compliance have less to lose by advancing. Using them as the vanguard of an assault is a sign of desperation, not strength. It means the pool of soldiers willing to advance voluntarily has become too small for operational needs, and coerced advance has become a regular feature of the assault cycle. The third mechanism is accelerated mobilization, replacing losses fast enough to maintain overall force numbers even as unit cohesion deteriorates. But replacement soldiers who arrive in units already experiencing systemic non-compliance don't reverse the culture. They get absorbed into it. They learn faster from their new unit environment than from any training they received beforehand. Replacement feeds the numbers, but not the willingness to fight. Here's something I want you to sit with for a moment, because this is where a lot of mainstream analysis stops reading the picture correctly. An army that looks strong on paper, that maintains its overall troop count through continuous mobilization, can simultaneously be hollowing out from the inside. Nominal strength and effective offensive power are not the same thing. If a significant proportion of soldiers in a formation will not advance when ordered to, the formation's real offensive power is a fraction of what its numbers suggest. Russian command understands this. That's precisely why barrier troops and punishment units exist. They are the command's admission that it cannot generate the assault momentum its numbers should theoretically produce. And here's what makes this a compounding problem, rather than a stable one. When soldiers are pushed forward under coercion rather than motivated by unit cohesion and shared purpose, the quality of the assault deteriorates. Coerced soldiers don't demonstrate initiative. They don't execute fire and movement with discipline. They don't communicate or coordinate the way small unit assault requires. They advance until they find cover where the immediate threat from the barrier troops behind them is no longer the most pressing danger. And then they stop. That creates static assault waves, sitting in the open or clumped behind whatever cover they found, perfectly positioned for Ukrainian drone and artillery targeting. More casualties. More rational assessments that refusing the next order is the better choice. More non-compliance. More coercion required. The cycle reinforces itself, and there is no clean way for Russian command to break out of it using the tools currently available. We're now at roughly the midpoint of this analysis, and if you're still watching, you already understand this at a level most people don't. Here's what I want you to do. Drop a comment right now with just one word. Holding. If you think the Russian military can stabilize this, or cracking, if you think the collapse is already underway. No long essay required. Just your honest read, and while you're at it, share this video, because the people watching cable news right now are getting the map and the numbers. They're not getting this. Now let's talk about what this actually means for the trajectory of the war. And I want to be honest here about where the evidence ends and projection begins, because the worst thing I can do is tell you more than the data actually supports. The evidence shows systemic non-compliance with assault orders across multiple Russian units. It does not show organizational collapse. Russian forces are still conducting assault operations. They are still generating pressure along the contact line. The breakdown in cohesion is a serious degradation of offensive capability, not the elimination of it, but degraded capability combined with a Ukrainian defensive evolution that is making every assault more costly, combined with pressure from Moscow to maintain visible forward momentum, creates a compounding problem with no clean exit. You cannot simultaneously demand the assault tempo that Moscow requires politically, sustain the casualty rates that tempo produces operationally, manage the unit-level non-compliance those casualties are generating, and maintain a domestic narrative of a professional and purposeful military campaign. Those four things are pulling in opposite directions, and when a system is being pulled apart by forces it can't reconcile, something eventually gives. The evidence of the past 6 months points clearly to what is giving. The internal cohesion of the force executing the strategy. Let's address the political dimension inside Russia, because the military analysis alone doesn't capture the full picture. The Kremlin has built its domestic narrative around a specific image. Russian soldiers as disciplined, patriotic professionals executing a necessary operation with competence and resolve. The evidence we've walked through, barrier troops coercing soldiers forward at gunpoint, punishment units used as expendable assault vanguards, men reporting that their officers explicitly told them reinforcements wouldn't come, is not compatible with that image, not even close. The audience that matters most here is Russian families, wives, mothers, sisters. The people receiving the phone calls and the private messages that describe conditions at the front that bear no resemblance to what state television is broadcasting. These aren't political dissidents. They're not organized opposition groups. They are ordinary people with direct personal connections to the reality of this war, and they are sharing what they know, in private communities, in quiet conversations, in ways that state media cannot fully reach or fully suppress. Every soldier who refuses an order has a family. Every family that learns the truth becomes a small source of pressure that the Kremlin cannot fully contain. Individually, these pressures are manageable. Accumulated over months and years, across hundreds of thousands of families, they become something harder to control. Ukraine does not need to win this war in a single decisive battlefield moment. What it needs to do is sustain enough pressure, militarily, politically, economically, long enough for the internal contradictions inside Russia's approach to become unmanageable. What the evidence of systemic order refusal tells us is that those contradictions are accumulating. They are not accumulating slowly, and the mechanisms Russian command is using to manage them, coercion, punishment units, replacement cycles, are not resolving the underlying problem. They are treating symptoms while the condition worsens. There is a version of this war's ending that doesn't look like a dramatic battlefield collapse. It looks like a slow internal unraveling, unit cohesion degrading increment by increment, assault effectiveness declining sector by sector, the gap between what Moscow demands and what the force can actually deliver widening until it can no longer be papered over. That version of events is not guaranteed. War is not predictable, and the Russian state has shown a capacity for absorbing costs that should not be underestimated. But the trajectory the current evidence describes points toward that kind of slow structural failure rather than a sudden reversal. The soldiers refusing orders along the Donetsk front line are not making a political statement. They are not ideologically opposed to the war or sympathetic to Ukraine. Most of them are simply doing the math. They are looking at the odds, looking at the men who went before them, and concluding that the order they've been given is more likely to end their life than accomplish anything. That conclusion, multiplied across thousands of men in dozens of units, is not a morale crisis in the sense military planners talk about managing. It is a rational response to an irrational situation. And rational responses, once they take hold, are much harder to reverse than emotional ones. The command structure above them knows this. The barrier troops know this. The punishment unit commanders know this. And somewhere above all of them, in the offices where strategy is made and casualty reports are read, there are people who know the arithmetic too, and who understand that the army they are ordering forward is not the same army that crossed the border. It is thinner in spirit than it is on paper. It is held together by coercion in places where cohesion used to exist. And it is being asked, day after day, to do the same thing that has already cost it so much, advance into positions where the men who went yesterday didn't come back. At some point, an army stops being an instrument of policy and becomes a measure of how far a state is willing to push the men it has left. Russia has not reached that point yet. But the evidence we've examined today says clearly it is closer than the maps suggest, closer than the casualty numbers alone reveal, and closer than any official source on either side has an interest in admitting. The front line moves in meters. The collapse, when it comes, moves differently. It moves in the quiet decisions of men who have done the math and decided that order isn't worth following. It moves in the phone calls home that families don't talk about publicly. It moves in the growing distance between what an army is told to do and what it actually does when no one with a gun is standing directly behind it. Watch the map if you want to, but watch the inside of that army too, because that is where the real story of this war is being written, in the language of men who have had enough, and commands that are running out of ways to make them care.